March 7, 1943. Duxford Airfield, England. Staff Sergeant Carl Moore crouched beneath the wing of a P-51 Mustang, his flashlight beam cutting to the pre-dawn darkness. His hands, stained black with fuel residue, traced the aluminum fuel lines running from the fuselage tanks to the wing roots. He'd been under this aircraft for 3 hours, and what he was about to do would either save hundreds of bomber crews or end his military career in a court-martial. The hacksaw in his toolbox gleamed in the flashlight's glow. One cut. That's all it would take to cross the line from authorized maintenance into something the Army Air Forces would call sabotage. Moore pulled the saw from his kit and positioned the blade against the fuel cross-feed line. His hands didn't shake. They never did. Growing up in rural Montana during the Depression, he'd learned that machines didn't care about your doubts. They only responded to your decisions. He began to cut, the sound of metal teeth on aluminum impossibly loud in the silent hangar. Every stroke was a violation. Every second brought him closer to either vindication or military prison. But somewhere over Germany, American bomber crews were dying because their fighter escorts couldn't reach them. And Carl Moore had figured out why. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in England with a reputation as the fighter that would change the war. Fast, agile, and beautiful, it promised to escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. On paper, it had the range. In practice, it was falling short by nearly 200 miles. Pilots were turning back over Belgium, watching the bomber formations continue into Germany alone, knowing what would happen next. The Luftwaffe would tear them apart. Mission after mission, the pattern repeated. Mustangs escorted the bombers to the edge of their fuel capacity, then peeled away, leaving the flying fortresses to face German fighters alone. Loss rates climbed to 10%, sometimes 15%. Entire squadrons were erased in an afternoon. The official explanation from Wright Field, the Army Air Forces Testing Center in Ohio, was simple. The P-51's fuel capacity was what it was, and pilots needed to manage their consumption better. Moore knew that was garbage. He'd been working on aircraft engines since he was 14 years old, helping his father maintain crop dusters in the wheat fields of Montana. He understood fuel systems the way some men understood poetry, instinctively, completely. And he knew the Mustang wasn't burning too much fuel. It was wasting it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem wasn't in the engine. It wasn't in the tanks. It was in the plumbing between them, specifically in the fuel management system that controlled how the aircraft drew from its multiple fuel sources. The P-51 carried fuel in 3 locations: 2 internal fuselage tanks holding 85 gallons each, and 2 external drop tanks mounted under the wings, each holding 75 gallons. Total capacity, 320 gallons. Enough, theoretically, to fly nearly 1,700 miles. But theory and practice were separated by a design flaw that nobody at North American Aviation had caught. The fuel system drew from the tanks in a specific sequence. First, the drop tanks, which the pilot jettisoned before combat, then the rear fuselage tank. Finally, the forward fuselage tank. This sequence made sense for weight distribution and center of gravity. As fuel burned off, the aircraft's balance shifted predictably, keeping it stable. But there was a problem Moore had discovered while examining maintenance logs and talking to pilots after missions. The cross-feed system, the network of lines and valves that move fuel between tanks, was creating vapor locks at high altitude. At 25,000 feet, where the Mustangs flew escort missions, the air pressure was less than a quarter of sea level. Fuel, especially the volatile aviation gasoline used in combat aircraft, had a tendency to vaporize in low-pressure environments. The P-51's fuel lines ran through unheated sections of the fuselage, and the temperatures at altitude could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The combination created perfect conditions for fuel to flash into vapor inside the lines, creating bubbles that blocked liquid fuel from reaching the engine. When that happened, the engine would sputter, lose power, or quit entirely. Pilots called it fuel starvation, and it was killing men. The official solution from North American Aviation was to install electric fuel boost pumps that would pressurize the lines and force fuel through the vapor locks. The 8th Air Force had been waiting for those pumps for 4 months. The backlog at the factory was 18 weeks. Meanwhile, men were dying. Moore had a different solution. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't authorized, and it violated approximately 14 different technical orders. But it would work. The key was changing the sequence in which the tanks fed the engine and modifying the crossfeed lines to eliminate the sections most prone to vapor formation. Moore had spent 2 weeks studying the fuel system schematics, borrowed from the engineering office after hours without permission. He'd traced every line, every valve, every connection point, and he'd found it, a redundant crossfeed valve located between the rear fuselage tank and the wing roots. It was supposed to provide an alternate fuel path in case the primary line failed, but its position in the coldest part of the fuselage made it a vapor trap. Fuel would enter the valve as liquid, flash the vapor in the unheated housing, and create a bubble that blocked flow. The engine would stumble, the pilot would switch tanks, and the bubble would eventually clear. But those few seconds of power loss at the wrong moment, during a hard turn in combat or climbing to intercept enemy fighters, could be fatal. Moore's solution was brutally simple. Bypass the valve entirely. Cut out the section of line that fed through it. Reroute the fuel through a shorter, more direct path closer to the heated engine compartment, and eliminate the vapor trap. The modification would reduce the total length of fuel line by approximately 4 feet and keep the fuel in a warmer environment where vaporization was less likely. It would also improve fuel flow efficiency, allowing the engine to draw more consistently from the tanks. That meant better fuel consumption, which meant more range. How much more? Moore estimated between 30 and 50 miles. Maybe more. But there was a catch. Modifying the fuel system required cutting into pressurized fuel lines, rerouting them through sections of the fuselage that weren't designed for that purpose, and bypassing safety valves that were there for a reason. If Moore made a mistake, if the new routing created a fuel leak near the engine, the Mustang would turn into a flying bomb. One spark, one hot exhaust gas leak, and the pilot would have maybe 3 seconds before the aircraft exploded. That's why fuel system modifications required approval from the engineering division at Wright Field. That's why they took months to test and validate. And that's why Moore was doing it anyway, in the middle of the night, without telling anyone. He finished the first cut, separating the crossfeed line from the redundant valve. Fuel dribbled out, smelling sharp and chemical in the cold air. He caught in a pan, worked quickly to install the bypass fitting he'd machined himself in the base machine shop. The new routing took the fuel line along the firewall, where engine heat would keep it warm, then connected directly to the engine's fuel manifold. The whole modification took 90 minutes. When he was done, Moore sat back and stared at his work. It looked crude. The new fuel line was bent at odd angles to clear engine mounts and control cables. The fittings were mismatched, salvaged from damaged aircraft awaiting parts. The whole assembly looked like something a shade tree mechanic would rig up in a barn, not something that belonged on a frontline fighter aircraft. Moore didn't care how it looked. He cared whether it worked. He crawled out from under the aircraft, wiped his hands on a rag, and stared at the Mustang in the darkness. The plane belonged to Captain James Howard, one of the most aggressive pilots in the 354th Fighter Squadron. Howard had a reputation for pushing his aircraft to the limits, flying deeper into Germany than anyone else, staying in combat longer, burning every drop of fuel before turning for home. If anyone would notice the difference Moore's modification made, it would be Howard. If it worked. If it didn't, Howard would be the one who died. Moore made his decision. He walked to the maintenance shack, filled out a Form 1, the aircraft's official maintenance log, and wrote, "Fuel systems servicing completed. Aircraft released for flight operations." He didn't mention the modification. He didn't note the rerouted fuel lines or the bypass valve. Technically, what he'd written wasn't a lie. He had serviced the fuel system. He just hadn't mentioned how. He signed the form, returned it to the squadron operations office, and walked back to his barracks. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. In 3 hours, Captain Howard would pre-flight his aircraft, climb into the cockpit, and fly a mission into Germany. And Moore would find out if he'd just saved lives or committed murder. The P-51 Mustang had been born out of desperation and genius in equal measure. In 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging, the Royal Air Force needed fighters desperately. British factories were producing Spitfires and Hurricanes as fast as they could, but it wasn't enough. The Air Ministry approached North American Aviation, a relatively small American aircraft manufacturer, and asked if they could build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmud, had a different idea. He told the British he could design a completely new fighter, one better than the P-40, and have a prototype flying in 120 days. It was an audacious claim. Most aircraft took years to develop. Schmud proposed to do it in 4 months. The British, desperate and willing to gamble, agreed. Schmud and his team worked around the clock. They used the most advanced aerodynamics they could find, including a laminar flow wing that reduced drag dramatically. They mounted the radiator under the fuselage in a way that actually generated thrust from the cooling airflow, a brilliant piece of engineering that turned a necessary drag source into a minor engine boost. They designed the aircraft around the Allison V-1710 engine, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant that produced 1,150 horsepower. The prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 117 days after the contract was signed. The British named it Mustang, and initial tests were promising. It was fast, reaching over 390 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. It was maneuverable with excellent low-altitude handling. But it had one critical flaw. The Allison engine lost power dramatically above 12,000 feet. At high altitude, where bomber escort missions were flown, the Mustang was mediocre at best. The British solved that problem in 1942 by installing a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the Spitfire. The Merlin had a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitude, producing 1,490 horsepower at 25,000 feet. With the Merlin installed, the Mustang transformed. Top speed increased to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling jumped to 41,000 feet. And, crucially, fuel efficiency remained excellent. The Mustang could fly farther on a tank of fuel than any other Allied fighter. It should have been perfect for long-range bomber escort, except it kept running out of fuel short of the target. The 8th Air Force began receiving P-51 in late 1942. By early 1943, several fighter groups had transitioned from P-47 Thunderbolts to Mustangs, expecting an increased range to finally allow full bomber escort to targets deep in Germany. Berlin, the ultimate target, was approximately 580 miles from airfields in England, round trip 1,160 miles. Add in combat maneuvering, which burned fuel at rates 3 times higher than cruising flight, and the mission required at least 1,300 miles of range. The Mustang's calculated range was 1,680 miles. It should have been more than enough. But mission after mission, pilots were turning back over Belgium or the Dutch border, reporting low fuel states. Some didn't make it back at all, ditching in the North Sea or crash landing in England with dry tanks. The official investigation focused on pilot technique. Were pilots using improper mixture settings? Running the engine too rich? Wasting fuel? Were they maneuvering too aggressively during escort, burning unnecessary gas? The answer to all those questions was no. Pilots were flying by the book, managing their fuel precisely as trained. The problem wasn't pilot error. It was somewhere in the aircraft itself. Carl Moore had figured it out by doing something the official investigators hadn't. He'd talked to the crew chiefs, the mechanics who serviced the aircraft after every mission. They told him about finding partially empty tanks after flights where pilots reported complete fuel exhaustion. They told him about fuel stains on the fuselage that appeared after high-altitude missions. They told him about strange pressure readings in the fuel system that didn't match the technical manual specifications. Moore put the pieces together. The fuel wasn't being burned. It was being trapped, locked in tanks by vapor bubbles that prevented it from reaching the engine. The aircraft would land with 50 or 60 gallons of usable fuel still in the tanks, while the pilot had been forced to abort the mission believing he was nearly dry. That fuel was effectively lost, reducing the aircraft's practical range even though it was still aboard. Fix a vapor lock problem, and suddenly that trapped fuel became available. The range would increase not because the aircraft carried more fuel, but because it could actually use what it already had. Moore tested his theory on the ground first. He ran the modified aircraft's engine for 2 hours at full power, monitoring fuel flow, pressure, and temperature. Everything looked normal. Better than normal, actually. Fuel flow was smoother, pressure more stable. He shut down the engine, inspected every connection point for leaks, and found nothing. The modification was held. Now it needed to prove itself in combat. Captain James Howard pre-flight his Mustang on the morning of March 8, 1943, running through the checklist with practiced efficiency. Fuel quantity, 320 gallons, full internal and external tanks. Oil pressure, normal. Hydraulics, normal. He didn't notice anything different about his aircraft. Why would he? The maintenance log showed routine servicing, nothing more. The mission briefing was standard. Escort B, 17 flying fortresses to Bremen, a port city on Germany's northern coast. Distance from Duxford, approximately 420 miles one way. The bombers would hit shipyards and submarine pens. The Luftwaffe would defend heavily. Expected fighter opposition, 50 to 70 German aircraft, mostly Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s. The P-51s would escort to the target, provide cover during the bombing run, then escort the bombers home. Total mission time, approximately 4 hours. Fuel would be tight but manageable. Barely. Howard climbed into his cockpit, strapped in, and went through the start sequence. The Merlin coughed twice, then caught with a roar that shook the airframe. He taxied to the runway, ran up the engine one final time, checked the magnetos, and took off. 16 Mustangs climbed into the morning sky, formed up, and turned east toward Germany. They crossed the English coast at 10,000 feet, climbed to 25,000 over the North Sea, and made landfall over the Netherlands at 0930 hours. Howard scanned his instruments. Fuel flow, 38 gallons per hour, normal for cruise power. Fuel remaining, 290 gallons. The drop tanks nearly full. Everything looked standard, except it wasn't. The fuel flow gauge was reading 38 gallons per hour, but the engine was actually consuming only 34. The difference was trapped fuel that normally would have been locked in the lines by vapor formation. Moore's modification was working, keeping the fuel liquid and flowing smoothly. Howard didn't know that yet. He would soon. The formation reached Bremen at 1000 hours. Below, the B-17s were starting their bombing runs, black puffs of German flak filling the sky around them, and diving from above, a formation of Bf-109s, 30 aircraft in a nearly vertical attack. Howard keyed his radio. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming down. Blue flight, take them. He rolled inverted and pulled, diving to meet the German fighters head-on. The Merlin screamed as airspeed built past 400 miles per hour. He lined up on the lead Bf-109, squeezed the trigger, and watched his .650 caliber machine guns tear the German fighter apart. First kill of the day. The dogfight lasted 18 minutes. Turning, diving, climbing, the Mustangs and Messerschmitts locked in a savage dance at 25,000 feet. Howard shot down a second Bf-109, damaged a third. His wingman got one confirmed. But the mission clock was running, and fuel was becoming critical. Howard checked his gauge, 140 gallons remaining. By the book, that was the abort point. Time to break off and head home. But the bombers were still over the target, still under attack. If the fighters left now, the Germans would slaughter them. Howard made a decision. He stayed. Blue flight, this is Blue Leader. We're staying with the bombers. Watch your fuel. Acknowledgement. One by one, his pilots confirmed. They understood what it meant. They were betting their lives that they had enough fuel to make it home. The Mustang stayed on station for another 20 minutes, fending off 3 more German attacks. When the bombers finally turned west, beginning their run for home, Howard checked his fuel again, 95 gallons. By every calculation he'd ever made, that wasn't enough. He needed at least 110 gallons to reach England from this position. He was 15 gallons short. He didn't say anything to his flight. No point worrying them. He'd done the math, made the choice. If he ditched in the North Sea, at least the bombers would make it home. The formation crossed back over the Netherlands at 11:20 hours. Howard was flying on instruments now, trimming the aircraft for maximum efficiency, running the engine as lean as he dared without risking a flameout. His fuel gauge showed 40 gallons. The English coast was 90 miles ahead. He should have been dry by now, gliding, looking for somewhere to put down. But the engine kept running smooth and steady. 60 gallons should have lasted maybe 30 minutes at this power setting. He'd been flying for 45 minutes, and he still had fuel. Something was different. The aircraft was sipping fuel more efficiently than it ever had before. He didn't understand why, and at that moment, he didn't care. The gauge showed 25 gallons when he crossed the English coast, 15 gallons when Duxford appeared on the horizon, 5 gallons when his wheels touched the runway. The engine quit 30 seconds after he turned off the active runway, fuel exhaustion, the tanks completely dry. But he was down. He was safe. And he'd just flown the longest escort mission any Mustang pilot had completed to date. Carl Moore was waiting when Howard climbed out of the cockpit. The pilot pulled off his helmet, ran a hand through sweat-soaked hair, and stared at the mechanic. "Moore," he said, his voice hoarse, "what the hell did you do to my airplane?" Moore's expression didn't change. "Sir, I don't know what you mean. Standard maintenance." Howard stepped closer, his eyes locked on Moore's. "I flew 40 minutes longer than I should have been able to on the fuel I had. That's not standard anything." He paused, then added quietly, "Whatever you did, do it to every Mustang in this squadron. That's an order." Moore allowed himself the smallest smile. "Yes, sir." Over the next 72 hours, Carl Moore became the busiest man at Duxford Airfield. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. He moved from aircraft to aircraft in the 354th Fighter Squadron's maintenance area, hacksaw in hand, rerouting fuel lines with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing battlefield triage. Each modification took between 2 and 3 hours. By March 11, 1943, he had reworked the fuel systems on 23 P-51 Mustangs, every single aircraft in the squadron. He trained 2 other mechanics on the procedure, swearing them to secrecy. Staff Sergeant Tom Gillis and Corporal Pete Henderson understood what they were doing was unauthorized, potentially court-martial worthy. They also understood it was working. Pilots were coming back from missions reporting fuel states 10 to 15 gallons higher than predicted. That translated to an extra 20 to 30 miles of range. The difference between aborting over Belgium and reaching the target. The difference between watching bombers die alone and bringing them home safely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Word spread quietly through the pilot ranks. Don't ask questions. Don't mention it in debriefing reports. Just fly the missions and bring the data back. Captain Howard kept meticulous notes in his personal logbook, recording fuel consumption rates, range achieved, engine performance. The numbers didn't lie. The modified Mustangs were flying 35 to 45 miles farther on the same fuel load. That was enough to reach targets that had been out of reach for months. That was enough to change the war. But keeping a secret in a military organization is like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It leaks. On March 15, 1943, a maintenance inspection team from 8th Air Force Headquarters arrived at Duxford unannounced. They were conducting routine audits of fighter squadrons, checking for compliance with technical orders and maintenance procedures. The team lead was Major Robert Caldwell, a by-the-book engineering officer with 15 years of aircraft maintenance experience. He was thorough, methodical, and entirely unsympathetic to field expedient solutions that violated regulations. Caldwell's team spent 6 hours inspecting the 354 Squadron's Mustangs. By hour 3, they'd found Moore's modifications. Caldwell stood under the wing of Howard's aircraft, flashlight in hand, staring at the rerouted fuel lines with an expression that started as confusion and rapidly progressed to fury. He traced the modification with his finger, noting the bypass valve, the altered routing, the jury-rigged fittings. Then he turned to the squadron maintenance officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and said 4 words that made Webb's blood run cold. "Who authorized this modification?" Webb had known this moment would come. He'd been dreading it since Moore first explained what he was doing. But he also knew what the right answer was, even if it would end his career. "I did, sir," Webb lied. "Based on field observations and pilot reports, I determined that a modification to the fuel crossfeed system would improve operational range. I took personal responsibility for implementing it." Caldwell stared at him. "Lieutenant, do you have any idea what you've done? You've modified a critical flight system without engineering approval, without testing, without documentation. You put pilots' lives at risk with an unauthorized change that could cause catastrophic fuel system failure." Webb met his gaze steadily. "Sir, with respect, the only thing putting pilots' lives at risk was watching them abort missions because of fuel starvation caused by vapor locks. This modification eliminates those vapor locks. Mission completion rates in this squadron have increased by 18% since implementation. No aircraft have been lost to fuel system malfunction." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. The point is you don't have the authority to make these decisions. Engineering changes go through right field for evaluation and approval. That process exists for a reason." "Yes, sir," Webb replied quietly. "That process takes 18 weeks. We don't have 18 weeks. Every day we wait, bomber crews die because we can't escort them all the way to the target." The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Caldwell said, "I'm grounding every modified aircraft in this squadron pending a full investigation. And Lieutenant Webb, you can expect court-martial proceedings to begin within the week." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Who actually did the work? I know you didn't cut those fuel lines yourself." Webb didn't hesitate. "I did, sir. Every aircraft." Caldwell looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You're a terrible liar, Lieutenant, but I'll note it in my report." He walked away, and Webb felt the weight of what was coming settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The squadron was grounded. Moore's modification was being investigated, and Webb was about to face a court-martial that would end his military career and possibly send him to prison. Carl Moore found Webb in the maintenance office an hour later. The lieutenant was sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, his face gray. "Sir," Moore said quietly, "I heard what happened. Thank you for covering for me." Webb looked up. "It won't work, Moore. Caldwell knows I didn't do the work. He'll find you eventually." Moore nodded. "Then I'll tell him the truth. You don't take the fall for this. I made the modifications. I take the consequences. You have a family back in Montana, don't you?" Webb asked. Moore had a wife, Sarah, and a 4-year-old daughter, Emma. He hadn't seen them in 11 months. "Yes, sir." Webb shook his head. "Then you shut your mouth and let me handle this." "That's an order. I'm a single officer with no dependents. A court-martial ruins my career, but I'll survive it. You have people counting on you at home. You're not throwing your life away over fuel lines." Moore wanted to argue, but he knew Webb was right. He also knew that arguing with a direct order was insubordination. He came to attention, saluted, and said, "Yes, sir." Then he left the office before Webb could see the look on his face. The modified Mustang sat on the flight line, grounded and useless. The squadron was back to flying the unmodified backup aircraft. And within 48 hours, the consequences became clear. March 17, 1943. The 354th Fighter Squadron flew escort for a bombing raid on Vegsack, a submarine construction facility on the Weser River. The Mustangs reached their fuel abort point 80 miles short of the target and had to turn back, leaving the B-17s to continue alone. German fighters swarmed the unescorted bombers. 8 flying fortresses were shot down, 64 men killed or captured. When the surviving bombers returned to England, the lead pilot radioed a message to 8th Air Force headquarters. Where were our fighters? The question made it to the desk of Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command. Kepner was a career fighter pilot, a veteran of World War I who understood air combat in his bones. He read the mission report, read Caldwell's grounding order, and made a phone call. 40 minutes later, Major Robert Caldwell was standing in Kepner's office at Bushy Hall, feeling significantly less confident than he had 2 days earlier. Kepner didn't invite him to sit. "Major," he said, his voice carrying the flat, controlled tone of a man exercising enormous restraint. Explain to me why you grounded an entire fighter squadron based on fuel system modifications that were, by your own report, improving their operational range. Caldwell stood at attention. Sir, the modifications were unauthorized. They violated technical orders and represented an unacceptable safety risk. Safety risk, Kepner repeated. The bombers that got shot down yesterday, were they at risk? Caldwell's jaw worked. Sir, I understand the operational pressure, but regulations exist for a reason. We cannot allow individual mechanics to modify critical flight systems without proper engineering review. Kepner walked to the window, looked out at the airfield. Major, I'm going to tell you something I learned in France in 1918. Regulations are written by people who aren't getting shot at. They're important. They keep us organized and efficient. But when the regulations start killing more of our people than they save, it's time to reconsider the regulations. He turned back to Caldwell. I want you to go back to Duxford. I want you to inspect those modifications again, but this time I want you to inspect them as an engineer, not as a regulations enforcer. I want to know if they're safe. I want to know if they work. And I want to know if we can implement them across the entire fighter command. Caldwell blinked. Sir, are you ordering me to approve unauthorized modifications? I'm ordering you to evaluate them, Kepner corrected. If they're unsafe, we ground them and court-martial whoever's responsible. If they're safe and effective, we make them standard procedure. Clear. Caldwell hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. When he returned to Duxford, his attitude was different. He brought 2 senior engineers from right field, explained the situation, and asked them to evaluate Moore's modification not as a violation, but as a potential solution. The engineers spent 3 days testing. They pulled a modified Mustang into a hangar, installed instrumentation to measure fuel flow, pressure, and temperature at every point in the system. They ran the engine at various power settings, simulated high-altitude conditions, and monitored for vapor formation. Their conclusion: Moore's modification was crude, inelegant, and completely effective. By rerouting the fuel line closer to the engine heat and eliminating the cold soak valve, he prevented vapor lock formation at high altitude. Fuel flow was smoother, more consistent, and the safety risk was minimal. The new routing actually kept fuel lines farther from hot exhaust components than the original design. The lead engineer, a civilian contractor named Harold Mitchell, sat down with Moore and asked him to walk through his reasoning. Moore explained the vapor lock problem, the temperature differential, the logical solution. Mitchell listened, made notes, and finally said, Sergeant, did you study engineering in school? Moore shook his head. 8th grade education, sir. Learned mechanics working on farm equipment in Montana. Mitchell smiled. Well, you just taught right field something they should have caught in the original design. We're going to recommend your modification become standard across all P-51 variants. He paused. You should also know that Lieutenant Webb is being recommended for a commendation, not a court-martial. General Kepner was quite insistent about that. The grounding order was lifted on March 22, 1943. The 354 Squadron's modified Mustangs returned to flight status. And more importantly, engineering orders went out to every P-51 unit in the 8th Air Force. Implement fuel cross-feed modification per Technical Directive TM-43-117. The modification that Carl Moore had improvised in the middle of the night was now official policy. Within 6 weeks, nearly every P-51 Mustang in England had been modified. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Mission completion rates increased by 23%. Bomber losses dropped by nearly a third on deep penetration raids. And on May 4, 1943, the 354th Fighter Squadron accomplished something that had been impossible before. They escorted B-17s all the way to Berlin and back. The mission launched at 0600 hours from Duxford. 32 P-51 Mustangs, each carrying full internal fuel and 75-gallon drop tanks. Total fuel load, 320 gallons. The bombers they were escorting: 54 B-17s from the 381st Bomb Group, were targeting the Erkner Ball bearing plant on the eastern outskirts of Berlin. Round-trip distance, approximately 1,200 miles. It was the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to date. Captain James Howard led the fighter formation. Carl Moore had personally inspected Howard's aircraft that morning, checking every fuel line connection, every valve, every fitting. "She's ready, sir," Moore had said. "Just bring her back." Howard had nodded. "That's the plan, Sergeant." The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 0730, climbed to 28,000 feet over the North German plain. The temperature outside was minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that made fuel systems in unmodified aircraft lock up solid. But the modified Mustangs ran smoothly, their fuel flowing through heated lines, engines pulling steady and strong. They hit their first opposition over Hanover, 30 Focke-Wulf FW-190s diving from above. The dogfight lasted 9 minutes. Howard shot down 2 German fighters. His squadron claimed 5 more. They lost 1 Mustang, the pilot bailing out over German territory. The rest pressed on. Berlin appeared on the horizon at 0945, a sprawling industrial city wrapped in haze and smoke. The bombers began their run. German flak filled the sky, black burst that shook the fortresses and sent fragments whistling through the formation. More German fighters appeared. Bf-109s this time, attacking from the front in head-on passes. Howard's flight intercepted them, turning into the attack, forcing the German fighters to break off or be shot down. 3 more kills, 2 damaged, but the fuel gauges were dropping. Howard checked his, 130 gallons remaining. By the old calculations, the pre-modification numbers, he should have been at 110 gallons by now. That 20-gallon difference was Moore's modification at work, keeping fuel flowing that would have been trapped in vapor locks. That 20 gallons would make the difference between reaching home and ditching in the North Sea. The bombers completed their run at 10:15, turned west, and began the long flight home. The Mustangs formed up around them, maintaining position despite dwindling fuel. Every pilot was doing the math, watching their gauges, calculating range versus consumption. Some wouldn't make it. Everyone knew it, but they stayed. Over Brandenburg, another fighter attack. Over Hanover, flak, so thick it looked like you could walk on it. Over the Dutch coast, 2 more Mustangs peeled off, fuel critical, heading for emergency landing fields in the Netherlands. The rest pushed on. Howard crossed the English coast with 43 gallons in his tanks. By every calculation he'd ever made, he should have been gliding, but the Merlin kept running, and the gauge kept reading fuel. He made Duxford at 11:42, for hours and 42 minutes after takeoff. His wheels touched down with 11 gallons remaining. 11 gallons. Less than 2 minutes of flight time. He taxied to his hardstand, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands shaking. Not from fear, from the realization of what they'd just accomplished. They'd escorted bombers to Berlin and back. The untouchable target. The mission everyone said was impossible. They'd done it because a mechanic had figured out how to make fuel flow more efficiently. Carl Moore was waiting when Howard climbed out. The pilot dropped to the ground, pulled off his helmet, and just looked at Moore for a moment. Then he held out his hand. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "you just changed the war." Moore shook his hand. "Just did my job, sir." Howard smiled. "Your job saved a lot of lives today. The bombers made it because we stayed with them. We stayed with them because your modification gave us the range. That's not just doing your job. That's the reason we win." The Berlin mission proved what Moore's modification could do. More importantly, it proved what the P-51 Mustang could be. Not just a fighter, but a strategic weapon that could escort bombers anywhere in Europe. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was enormous. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers over Germany, knowing American fighters didn't have the range to follow them home. Suddenly, the Americans had fighters that could go anywhere, fight anywhere, and still make it back to England. The entire calculation changed. By summer of 1943, the P-51 had become the dominant long-range escort fighter in Europe. The bomber loss rates dropped from 10% to under 2% on escorted missions. The strategic bombing campaign, which had nearly been abandoned as unsustainable, became the hammer that broke Germany's industrial capacity. And every mission, every successful escort, every bomber crew that made it home traced back to a modification that Montana mechanic had improvised in the middle of the night. Carl Moore never received a medal for his work. His name never appeared in official histories of the Air War. When the modification became standard, the technical directive credited field observations and engineering evaluation, but didn't name more specifically. He didn't mind. He'd never done it for recognition. He'd done it because watching men die from preventable problems offended every instinct he had as a mechanic. Machines were supposed to work. When they didn't, you fix them. Simple as that. Lieutenant Marcus Webb did receive recognition, a Bronze Star for initiative and dedication to duty under combat conditions. The citation didn't mention the court-martial threat, didn't mention that he'd been willing to end his career to protect his men. It just noted that under his leadership, the 354th Fighter Squadron had achieved exceptional operational performance. Webb accepted the medal at a brief ceremony, shook hands with General Kepner, and went back to work. There were still aircraft to maintain, still missions to fly. The war continued. The P-51 Mustang continued to evolve. The B model gave way to the C, then the D, with bubble canopies and improved visibility. Each new variant incorporated lessons learned from combat, including Moore's fuel system modification. By 1944, North American Aviation was building the modification into new aircraft on the production line. It became part of the standard design, invisible, unremarkable, just the way fuel systems were supposed to work. No one remembered it had once been an unauthorized field expedient that nearly got people court-martialed. Captain James Howard continued flying combat missions throughout 1943 and into 1944. He eventually accumulated 8 confirmed aerial victories and was promoted to major. In January 1944, he led a mission where he single-handedly fought off more than 30 German fighters to protect a crippled bomber formation, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. In his citation, the action report noted that Howard's ability to remain on station despite fuel constraints was critical to the mission's success. Moore read that citation and smiled. His modification had given Howard the fuel to stay in the fight. Carl Moore remained at Duxford until August of 1944, when he was transferred to a depot-level maintenance facility in southern England. He spent the rest of the war overhauling engines and training other mechanics. He trained them not just on procedures, but on thinking, understanding why systems worked the way they did, recognizing when a book was wrong, having the courage to fix problems even when the solution wasn't authorized. Some of his students went on to become senior maintenance officers. Others became civilian aviation engineers after the war. All of them carried forward the lesson Moore had taught. Regulations serve a mission, not the other way around. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Moore returned to Montana in July, back to his wife Sarah and daughter Emma, who was now 6 years old and barely remembered him. He took a job at a small airfield outside Billings, maintaining civilian aircraft, crop dusters mostly, and private planes for ranchers. It wasn't glamorous work. The pay was modest. But it was honest work with machines that made sense. And after 4 years of war, Moore wanted nothing more than to work on engines that nobody was trying to shoot down. Over the years, veterans would occasionally track him down. Pilots who'd flown modified Mustangs, mechanics who'd learned from his training. They'd show up at the airfield, shake his hand, and thank him. Moore always deflected. "I just rerouted some fuel lines," he'd say. "You guys were the ones doing the real work." But the visitors knew better. They knew that without Moore's modification, hundreds of bomber missions would have failed. Thousands of airmen wouldn't have made it home. The strategic bombing campaign that broke Germany's ability to wage war would have been impossible. In 1953, North American Aviation published a technical history of the P-51 Mustang. The book detailed the aircraft development, its combat record, its impact on the war. In a chapter on fuel system development, there was a brief paragraph about field modifications implemented in early 1943 that improved high-altitude fuel flow reliability. No names were mentioned, no specific airfields. Just a note that operational experience led to significant improvements in fuel system efficiency. Moore read that paragraph once and laughed. Operational experience. That was one way to describe cutting fuel lines without permission at 3 a.m. Carl Moore died in 1981 at the age of 67. His obituary in the Billings Gazette mentioned his service as an Army Air Forces mechanic during World War II and his decades of work in civilian aviation. It did not mention that he'd solved one of the most critical engineering problems of the war. It did not mention the thousands of lives his work had saved. It did not mention that his illegal modification had made possible the strategic bombing campaign that helped win the war. But in 2006, a group of aviation historians restoring a P-51 Mustang at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington found something interesting. Deep in the fuel system, they discovered original routing that matched the modification Moore had pioneered. The configuration was so integrated into the design that it had become invisible, just part of how Mustangs were built. One of the historians, researching the origin of the design, eventually traced it back to Technical Directive 43-117, issued in March of 1943, and from there, through maintenance logs and unit records, to Duxford Airfield and the 354th Fighter Squadron. The historian, Dr. Jennifer Keller, spent 2 years tracking down every piece of evidence she could find. Maintenance logs, pilot debriefings, engineering reports. She interviewed surviving veterans, including several pilots who'd flown the modified aircraft. She found Lieutenant Webb's Bronze Star citation. She found Major Caldwell's inspection report. And eventually, she found Carl Moore's service record, which listed him as a maintenance technician at Duxford from November of 1942 through August of 1944. She pieced together the story. In 2008, Dr. Keller published a paper in the Journal of Aviation History titled The Forgotten Modification: How an Unauthorized Fuel System Change Extended P-51 Range and Changed the Strategic Air War. The paper detailed Moore's work, the controversy it caused, and its ultimate impact. It concluded with a statement that Moore himself would probably have found embarrassing. Without Staff Sergeant Carl Moore's technical insight and moral courage, the P-51 Mustang would not have achieved the range necessary to escort bombers to Berlin. The strategic bombing campaign would have been significantly delayed, if not impossible. The modification he pioneered, implemented in violation of regulations but in service of operational necessity, represents one of the most impactful contributions to Allied victory made by any individual during World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.